Olá a todas e a todos.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcio Mignon. I am advisor to the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovations, MCTI, and currently also coordinator of the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, CGI.br, a multi-stakeholder committee responsible for monitoring, debating, and establishing a series of guidelines related to the development of the Internet in Brazil. Today, I'm addressing to you on a central topic to discuss Internet and the digital ecosystem, platform regulations. The digital economy has consolidated in the last 2 decades and has been one of the engines of global economic development. The emergence of the phenomenon of the so-called big techs or digital platforms has worried various actors, governmental and society, due to their economic and political power and their capacity to control over the flow of data on the internet that they have conquered. The impacts of business models based on the extraction and analysis of data on democratic process, individual behavior, the emergence of new forms of work drive a type of development that goes beyond the development. And it's not by coincidence that we have to regulate digital platforms that are driven and managed by digital economy that have reached a market value that is not yet understood. The steering committee in Brazil has created a working group that aims to regulate platforms, and we wanted to better understand digital platforms, and also we want to promote a discussion and to write technical notes and to create some workshops about that. Our goal is to expand our dialogue about this agenda and to increase our database so we can help CGI.br to cope with that. With that, our debates that will count on renowned professionals acknowledged worldwide that will be key to diagnose the power of the platforms, their business models, state of art of this debate, and international experiences that can be comparable with the specific tools to regulate that sector. This is the first step to reach our challenges that are ahead of us. With that, I wish you all a fruitful debate and a great event to all of you. Now I give the floor to Enrique. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope that you are all doing fine. So this is a conference that will address platforms, and we are just starting today. We are going to have 2 other days on the 25th and 27th. We are here to talk about platforms, regulatory frameworks, and to understand the challenges that have been raised with all societies and the big techs. Big techs, they had reached that economic and political power. Challenges that global platforms they have are many. Since constant surveillance of our online activities, such as an intermediate of disseminating activities, up to work as monopoly, creating barriers and obstacles to a number of services. With that, we are about to start a process to go deep and to expand a debate, to be able to collaborate and to create and build up a base of values that will try to reach a number of benefits, to enhance challenges, to create platforms. We are going to create business models modules here with Daphne that will help us to understand the role of platforms and how to moderate different contents. Next Tuesday, we are going to have a very interesting panel moderated by Carlos Souza that will talk about international experiences in regulating platforms in the United States, Europe, Asia, and we're going to have experts from OECD and from the Bank Center from Harvard. Then on the 27th, we are going to have two events. First, addressing thresholds and antitrust, and then we are going to have a talk about the power of platforms and the main topics addressing attempts to regulate them. We are very excited to have this circle of debates. And we hope to have a circle of debates on the second half of the year where we hope to include other players and actors, inviting the media industry, the different companies, and congressmen. We believe that not only Brazil, but other developing countries, they would like to participate and to discuss, suggesting alternatives regarding their own specificities about their own culture. So I invite you all to participate on this debate. Thank you so much for your participation. I hope that this debate will be very active. Now I'd like to give the floor to our moderator, Professor Luca Belli, who is a doctor in public rights, and he's also coordinator of the Society Center in Rio de Janeiro. You have the floor, Mr. Belli. Thank you, Enrique, and thank you, Marcio, for the invitation. I'd like to thank you enormously, CGI.br and Nick.br, for the invitation. That's an excellent initiative to address this important topic from a democratic, legal, economic, and social standpoint. It's a great honor to be the moderator of this opening conference. And we have our international guest, Daphne Keller, and I'd like now to switch to English so I can give some additional work to our dear interpreters. Now I'm going to switch to English.
With us, it's we know each other since several years, since we started both discussing platform regulation issues in international fora like the IGF, where we had a lot of occasions to speak together. You are one of the most renowned experts in platform regulations issue in the world. You are the directress of the platform regulation program at Stanford Cyber Policy Center. You have been spearheading some of the most interesting and I would say also innovative works and thinking about how platform should be regulated and could be regulated. There are some very interesting ideas that I hope you will, and I'm sure you will share with us today. And it is essential to have your keynote presentation as the first one opening this debate, to let also those who are following us today understand what is the interrelation between content moderation issues, platform business models, and regulatory models. And you are, I think, the perfect speakers to face and untangle this issue. So thank you very much, Daphne, for being with us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Luca, for that extremely generous introduction. And thank you to all the organizers and especially to the translators who are doing an amazing job. It is an honor to speak to a Brazilian audience about this because Brazil has been such an important leader in the field of platform regulation. I talk regularly about the Marco Civil to policymakers in the US and around the world. And you are very fortunate to both have had such a great legislative undertaking and also to have the great advocates and experts that are working on these issues in Brazil. So I'm going to talk a little bit about business models and how they shape regulation, starting with two ideas of platform business models that I think are wrong and that this audience probably knows are wrong, but that are worth paying attention to. The first is people think of platforms as just like older media. Have the idea that platforms might assume the legal obligations that we would give to a newspaper or to a broadcaster. The problem with that, of course, is that those are entities that publish very, very little speech. They exclude most speakers because they can only publish things that their lawyers can vet and confirm don't create liability. And so if we were to treat Twitter or Facebook or YouTube like traditional media, we would forfeit the ability for them to be a megaphone where any ordinary person can go and share their speech right away and have the incredible global effect on communication that they have had. On the other hand, the other business model that people sometimes imagine is like, well, if they're not like a publisher or a newspaper or broadcast, they must instead be like a phone company, an entity that we want to regulate in a way that requires passivity and neutral transmission. If that's what we want platforms to do, then it's fair to get mad at them for exercising editorial control and taking things down. But then you lose out on the benefits of having them, take down content that's obviously illegal, or take down content that courts determine is illegal, or engage in moderation that users want and appreciate. You also lose the ability to have a divergence of, this is a site that is about dogs and people can post information about dogs, but not cats. If you turn platforms into something like a telephone company, common carriers, then you kind of roll the internet experience back to being pretty chaotic, pretty decentralized. It's hard to find things and services are not very differentiated. But of course, I think everyone here knows platforms are neither of those two things. And it doesn't make sense to regulate them like either a publisher on the one hand or a telephone company on the other. One reason is that we benefit from the curation efforts that platforms make. It makes it possible for us to find things. It makes it possible to have, a diversity of sites that apply different rules and people can choose different discursive communities to join. We benefit from them not having to do the legal assessment that a publisher has to do, because it creates the ability for us to send our baby pictures or our, Me Too posts or police brutality videos, things that broadcasters would be wary of transmitting until their lawyers were able to vet it. Does this add up to meaning platforms should have no obligations? Of course not. It's just they shouldn't have the same obligations that we gave to these older kinds of media. And indeed, every country gives platforms legal responsibility for user content in some situations. In the US, for example, platforms have the same legal responsibility for federally criminal content as anybody else does. There's no immunity for federally criminal child sexual abuse material, for example, or material support of terrorist organizations. And then for copyright, there's a notice and takedown process. And for other things, there's immunity. The Marco Civil similarly has one set of rules for things like child sexual abuse material and non-consensual intimate imagery, and a different set of rules requiring courts to get involved when there's an allegation, for example, of defamation. And I think that's a good model. That's a model that is neither trying to go in this telephone direction or this publisher direction. That said, as I think all of our opening speakers alluded to, there is growing concern about the scale and the power of the biggest incumbent platforms, and about the ways in which they can act as gatekeepers, having a profound effect on public discourse, influencing what information flows, potentially influencing elections. This is a very big deal, and there's a reason that everybody is worried about it. In the US right now, and in a number of other countries around the world, this concern is seen as one of the political right. Even before the deplatforming of former President Trump, many speakers and litigants who tried to sue platforms claiming what I refer to as must-carry rights, the rights to force platforms to carry their content. Many of those actors came from the Republican Party or from the far right. But this is not an innately right-wing issue. There are just as many critics saying that, for example, Muslims or Black Lives Matter activists are getting unfairly silenced coming from the left. They just don't get as much airtime on cable news. And globally, we saw in Brazil, one of the early and very interesting must-carry claims had to do with Facebook taking down an image of an indigenous woman in the Amazon whose breasts were exposed under their nudity policy, and human rights advocates in Brazil saying, hey, wait a minute, this is a violation of the human rights to cultural diversity represented in this image. So, as I said, this is not innately a left or a right issue. Everyone is worried when a major gatekeeper can clamp down and reshape culture and discourse in a way that is hard to get around and hard to find an alternate way to communicate with people. I wrote a big paper on this. It's called Who Do You Sue? It's my best paper, so I recommend reading it. That goes through mostly the US law analysis of this issue, but a lot of it has overlap for Brazil and for other countries around the world. So, first of all, if you could compel platforms to carry content against their will, if you could prevail on a must-carry claim, as has happened a couple of times in Brazil and Italy and Germany and Poland, if you could, what would that mean? What is the world that we arrive at if that is a recognized right, and is it a world that we want? So one vision of a world with must-carry obligations is one in which platforms do zero content moderation. So every single thing that is legal, and maybe a bunch of illegal stuff too that they haven't spotted yet, all of that is suddenly on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And that's going to include things that are just barely legal, that are terrible, that are racist, that are pro-suicide content, pro-anorexia content, misinformation that doesn't quite rise to the level of violating the law. This would be the sort of cesspool of content that users would encounter on social media or on other kinds of platforms. That is a world that I think no one actually wants. Politicians don't want that because for the most part, they do want problematic misinformation about elections or COVID, for example, taken down. They do want to see restrictions of things that we might colloquially call fake news, but that are not prohibited under law and couldn't be consistent with human rights law. Users don't want a world where every single legal thing is on the platform because they don't want to sign on, to check in with their grandmother and instead see a bunch of racism or pornography. And advertisers definitely don't want that. They do not want their brands next to all of the lawful but awful material that would appear on platforms if they had to carry every single thing that's legal. So maybe there's another version of honoring must-carry claims in which we say, okay, well, platforms don't have to carry everything that is legal speech, but they do have to carry some things. We're going to make them carry, honor a reasonable standard, or they can carry legal speech, but take it down if it's indecent, come up with some new category. That's a pretty big deal too. It would be a massive undertaking to reconcile that regime with human rights if it's the law coming in and saying, hey, there's this category of previously legal speech that is now disfavored because it's the stuff that platforms are allowed to take down. And this other category of previously legal speech that is favored because platforms are not allowed to take it down. litigation process and the judicial process to figure out what a rights compliant version of that looks like, I think would be monumental in any country. And the realistic model for an outcome, I think, is you have to have a regulator, like a communications regulator, making these decisions about what content must be carried and what content can be taken down, which is a tremendous expansion of authority, for regulators to not regulate just what broadcasters are transmitting, for example, but to instead have this authority over your speech and my speech every time that we are communicating via platforms. And I can't speak for Brazil, but certainly in the US, the concern about political capture and about that kind of regulatory power being abused in the service of whichever party happens to be in power would be very significant. The other question about what a must-carry regime looks like in real life is about what the product implementation is. For example, might the law say that Twitter has to carry certain tweets? They can't remove them, but leave it that Twitter can demote them in its algorithm to the point of invisibility. And if it doesn't mean that, if in fact the regulator is coming in and saying, no, you cannot algorithmically demote this either, then we're in a world of regulatory oversight of algorithms that is also a tremendous step forward into regulatory control over ordinary people's discourse online, and also requires a degree of engineering expertise and staffing in regulatory bodies that's a little hard to imagine. The other big question about making platforms carry content is how to reconcile it with the First Amendment or with its global analogs. And this is something where the legal answers, the constitutional answers, are different in the US than they would be in a number of other countries. That's why there have been courts that have upheld some must-carry cases in the countries that I listed, and there have not in the US. In the US, there have been over 30 cases attempting to enforce must-carry rights, and platforms have won every single one of those cases. For one reason is because the platforms themselves have First Amendment rights to set editorial policy in a way that is recognized strongly in US law and less so in the laws of many other countries. But here, even under the US's sort of relatively extreme First Amendment doctrine, you get to some interesting answers that intersect with our questions about business models and also intersect with questions about competition specifically. If you look at the US case law about requiring cable companies to carry content, for example, or requiring television companies to carry content, the reasoning at heart is that the more a private communication channel owner is acting as a gatekeeper or a bottleneck or as the only place you can go to get your communication across, the more legitimate it becomes for lawmakers to intervene and say, hey, actually, there is some stuff that you do have to carry. In the US and in many other countries, that ability of the government to compel certain content to be carried on the platform is predicated on the idea of spectrum scarcity, of the idea that in broadcast, there are a finite number of channels on which to speak, and therefore having the government divvy them up makes sense. It is difficult in US precedent to translate that into regulation online, where in principle, there are an infinite number of other places that anyone can go to speak. Nonetheless, there are plenty of activists and academics looking at ideas like, well, maybe there's attention scarcity. Maybe there is a doctrinal hook for compelling the biggest platforms to carry content if they have a monopoly over too much of the share of the audience and of user attention. This gets me back to business models, because I think in this situation we're in, where there's such concern about gatekeeper power and such desire for a greater diversity of smaller gatekeepers, different people setting different rules so that there aren't a handful of giant corporations really shaping what we all see. There are some business model responses or competition law-based responses that might be useful. And one thing that makes these competition-based responses useful is that they might bypass the questions about speech. They avoid having the government set the speech rules saying you have to carry this or you cannot carry that. And they instead intervene purely at an economic level. The idea here is, first, that the traditional remedies of competition and antitrust involving breaking up a big company into smaller companies don't work very well for social media and online platforms because they benefit from network effects. And so in principle, if you broke Facebook into 15 Facebooks, they would have an economic reason to reconvene into one big Facebook again. So you can't, we assume that doesn't work very well. But there's this other alternative, which in economic terms could be thought of as unbundling, or in telecommunications terms can be thought of as unbundling. This is the idea broadly of having a mechanism to bring competition into markets that are subject to network effects by requiring the incumbents to license their resources to newcomers, to license resources that are hard to duplicate, in particular, to newcomers. And in the case of today's biggest platforms, the resource they have that's hard to duplicate is us. It's our data and our content and our social graphs of, who our contacts and connections are. That's the thing that competitors would need access to in order to provide viable competition. And if there were a mechanism to give competitors access to that treasure trove of data and user content, then you could potentially bring in competitors who build on top of Facebook or build on top of Twitter, but offer a different set of content moderation rules. You could have a Disney version of Twitter that is pretty boring. You could have a politically far right version of Facebook that focuses on one set of perspectives. You could have a women's rights oriented version of YouTube that sets ranking priorities in a way to maximize female voices. These other entities could come in and offer different content moderation rules, different ranking, possibly even different user interfaces, such that users could then choose which set of rules they want to live under. That has the benefit both of creating a lot of different smaller communities with pluralism and diversity and different rules, and also of reducing the gatekeeper power of specific incumbent to set the rules for everyone else, because now there are a whole bunch of little gatekeepers. It also, if it can be implemented, creates a way for example, if you are a female journalist on Twitter who is being harassed, you can migrate to a version of Twitter that has more robust enforcement against harassers without losing access to all your contacts, losing the history of your tweets and the responses, losing all of the things that make you want to stay on Twitter. This model, I think, it's been around in various forms for a long time, but it is an idea whose time has come. There is important writing on it from Mike Masnick, for example, who has a model he calls protocols, not platforms. There's important writing from Cory Doctorow, who he calls this competitive compatibility now, but he used to call it adversarial interoperability, which is a term I like much better. And he is very interested in the ways that we can move toward better innovation by allowing newcomers to basically forcibly interoperate with the incumbents and offer new services. More recently, my Stanford colleague, Francis Fukuyama, has written about this with pretty robust competition analysis behind his thinking. using the title of middleware. And most interestingly, Twitter is experimenting with actually building it. They have something called Project Blue Sky, which is an effort to build out exactly this kind of different and competing set of lenses for content moderation. There are challenges in doing this. There are, in fact, I think very big challenges in doing this. I did a talk last week for the Knight Foundation about the privacy challenges in particular and the challenges in content moderation. But those are things we can work on. This is a space where bringing engineers and technologists and privacy experts and speech experts and competition experts together to hammer on the problem might actually yield progress. And that makes it very different from the potential speech regulation avenues that get discussed in legislatures, but which in many cases are dead ends for reasons of users' rights, constitutional rights, et cetera, or simply because they would not lead to an outcome that people actually like. So with that, I'm going to stop. I know that Luca has himself done some really interesting work on the interoperability issues here. And so I really look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for the very enlightening talk. And actually, you raise a lot of very interesting points that I really want to comment on, and also that led me to think about other good questions that we could start with. And then also I would like to encourage all the participants, all those who are watching the live broadcasting on YouTube, to actually include their thoughts, their questions, their comments in the YouTube chat, so that we can convey them to Daphne. Now, some very interesting points that you highlighted. A first very important point on which I wanted to reflect is the fact that we are speaking about social media platforms here. And when we speak about platforms, there are many different types of platforms that have very different business models and very different dynamics. And social media platforms, that is the issue of the day in this discussion, is one of the types of platforms. And then also a specific type of platforms that automatically leads the listener to think about Facebook, Twitter, gigantic social media. Actually, a very important point that I wanted to stress with you, and maybe to have, it would be the first question that I would ask you in order to have your thoughts on this, is how can we think about creating rules that are efficient for every kind of player, and that do not only apply to Facebook and Twitter if we create the rule only having Facebook and Twitter in mind. And let me just provide a little bit more of context, because maybe to make it clear, if we only have gigantic corporation in mind when we have to craft the rule, then we will create a rule that probably only gigantic corporation will be able to comply with. And we may end up creating a beautiful rule for gigantic corporation that will create a huge filter for small and medium enterprises, startups, or social media that are niche ones, but may have exactly the decentralized kind of content moderation approach that you are putting forward, like Mastodon, for instance, which is a federated social network, a niche one so far, but with very interesting ideas, from which I would say Twitter is also copying a little bit in order to create their project. So my first question is, how do you think that an efficient, a sustainable regulatory model could be crafted without risking creating a filter that will allow only established dominant player to comply with the rule?
Yeah, it is an incredibly important question. And this is something where I think the EU is in the process of making some very big mistakes. It is all too easy for lawmakers who mostly only hear about the giant incumbents, the Facebooks and YouTubes and so forth of the world, to do exactly as you just described, Luca, to craft rules that make sense for them, or that maybe don't even, but were intended to make sense for them. And then the smaller competitors just cannot possibly afford to hire 30,000 content moderators or to invest $100 million in content filters as YouTube did, and just give up. They cannot be in that space because they can't afford to comply with the new requirements. What the EU is doing is, first of all, they have different obligations depending which technological category you fall into, whether you're a host or a transmission provider, a caching provider. That I think is somewhat useful. Certainly, if you are going to create a bunch of obligations, then it is definitely useful. You definitely don't want to treat everyone up and down the technical stack the same way that you treat a consumer-facing provider like Facebook. But secondly, they are trying to make distinctions based on size. So there are several different breakdowns within the Digital Services Act in which the bigger you get as a platform, the greater the obligations that you have. But I think they have erred way too much on the side of treating little companies like big companies and are putting very heavy procedural obligations on them that will have a real burden, very burdensome effect for competition and for future innovation. And, if you want to be cynical about it, you can think of this as a conscious trade-off, saying we're going to prioritize content regulation at the expense of competition and, create a world where there's a small handful of incumbents and we can tell them what to do. And there isn't this, chaos of different entities on the internet that we had for its first few decades. I do think, though, that in this, the model that I described, which I call this magic APIs when I write about it. Francis Fukuyama calls it middleware, which is maybe a catchier title. In the magic APIs model, there's a little bit of a different way of coming at the problem, because you can say that, Facebook, which is now offering both its own regular old service and being the foundation for a bunch of competing services that use the same content but rank it differently or remove things differently. You can say that Facebook still has to take down stuff that's illegal, subject to whatever the rules are. They wait for a court order, or if it's child sexual abuse material, they recognize it themselves, et cetera. But they do that initial and quite expensive step of responding to illegal content, so that then these smaller providers, who are offering the women's rights flavor of YouTube or, whatever, they aren't carrying that burden. So you can put part of the burden on the incumbent and then have the smaller new competitors realize the benefit of the work that's been put on the incumbent. That sounds good. It'd be great if it worked perfectly. Of course, the downside is if the incumbent, the sort of hub that's sending out content to these competing spokes, if they take down the wrong thing, then it's down for everyone. So you don't want to mess things up at the center of the operation if their decisions flow out to everyone else.
I mean, actually, this is a very good point, and leads me to another consideration that then will be a very good segue for a couple of questions that just arrived in the chat. So, I mean, here's the thing: if you have the magic API that you describe very well in your paper, the middleware, if we want to utilize Fukuyama's terminology, I mean, it sounds excellent in theory. But the nitty-gritty details, technical details of how to create it, I mean, they are the most difficult part. And this really resonates a lot also with the right to data portability, which is an excellent idea. We have it now in Brazil, thanks to Article 18 of LGPD, everyone has the right to data portability. As in Europe, everyone, thanks to Article 20 GDPR, has the right to data portability. But in practice, no one has it, because it's something that is theoretic, not even theoretically, it's legally in the letter of the law, but to enjoy it, you need to have interoperability standards, technology that allows you to enjoy fully the right that does not exist, or it is not shared by all the providers so far. So this is a huge hurdle here. They see, well, there are two. First, having a rule that is smart and sufficiently good quality, and then the technology that allow to implement the rule and to enjoy the rights from the user side. So do you think that it wouldn't be also good to promote investment in technologies that it's very good to have Twitter working on this, but with all due respect for Twitter, which is a company we like, they are accountable to their shareholders before being accountable to society at large, as any corporation is. And this is not a critique to corporations, it's a very objective statement. So if something has to be done in the public interest, wouldn't it be good to match the regulation also with funds investment in massive, I would say, investment in technology and research to bake values within the technology, not only within the law? What do you think about this?
I think you are right about there being very major technological hurdles. And this is why I use the word magic in calling it magic APIs, because I'm not sure, even if Facebook or Google or whoever is cooperating as well as they can, it might still be really hard to remotely, run a query across Google's whole search corpus as quickly as Google can do it. So I think there's a huge technological hurdle. There's also a big hurdle about how these new competitors are going to make money. You have to figure out a way, either assuming we're still in a world of advertising-based businesses, to figure out how the ad revenue flows to them and what new both technological structures for data flow and contractual structures for subdividing the money, how that works. And then the other two, I think, much bigger hurdles are, as you and I have talked about, sorting out user privacy and sorting out the costs of content moderation. As to whether public investment is the right answer to arrive at actual compliance with a mandate like this, I need to think about that more. I think standard setting doesn't happen with participants that don't really want standards to get set. And so having some forcing function to make that happen will be important. And whether that is the government coming in and investing in defining standards, or punishment if the companies fail to develop them, I'm not sure what I think is the right mechanism there, but it definitely needs a lot of work and somebody needs to pay for that work.
So now there are two follow-up questions that are, one of them was proposed by Professor Marcus Dantas, who is a good friend and an old friend of CGI, and he actually was putting forward a very interesting idea, which is a critique maybe about the model that you are suggesting about this magic app allowing to having or the middleware allowing to have competing version with competing different flavors of content moderation. So wouldn't this be a sort of institutionalization of existing filter bubbles? So wouldn't this be basically a moderation according to the filter bubble?
Yes. I mean, that is the biggest downside Definitely. I mean, to the extent that we're focused on speech and information and democracy issues, the single biggest downside of this model is that it does let people opt in to an environment of all lies or all hate speech. That said, people can do that with their media diet now. And in the US, it would be unconstitutional to stop them. And so that might be a problem that we have a hard time getting away from. The upside that you get in exchange for that is, again, diversity, a pluralism of platform content moderation so that there aren't just a small handful of companies really controlling what all of us see. And places for users to opt into the speech rules they want to live under. This is the, female journalists or Jewish journalists fleeing Twitter because they get so much abuse there and finding a version of Twitter that works for them. So there's this other set of benefits. Maybe you can, if you're worried about your parents falling prey to barely legal fake news, you help them set up a filter that's going to put labels on things from a trusted journalistic organization. There are just a lot of other problems that we can address through the Magic APIs model. And I'm not sure we're going to fix the filter bubbles problem with any other approach anyway. And so on balance, I think it is a better direction to go in.
And another question, maybe will be the final one, because I see that we have only 10 minutes left, and this maybe requires a little bit of discussion. So there was a participant asking to provide a little bit more of your thoughts on first of all, explain a little bit more about how unbundling would work within platforms. And then which kind of risks and benefits this entail. And actually, this is also something on which I would chip in to, because I've been seriously thinking about this for the past years, because my past experience in telecom law has immediately led me to think about unbundling. But there is a major difference, which is in telecoms. The dominant operator gives access to infrastructure which is neutral, and everyone can use it, and there is no problem in using the infrastructure, at least no negative externality in terms of, for instance, data protection or cybersecurity. Whereas with regard to platform, the resource that you very rightly pointed out in your talk is held by the dominant platform, is us, is our data, is our personal data on our most intimate sides of our lives. So it is not like giving open access to a neutral infrastructure. It's like giving open access to everything, to a very detailed profile of anything I do in my life to I don't know who. So that is not exactly the same thing, and maybe a time bomb in terms of data protection and cybersecurity if it is not done in a very careful way through anonymization and through a series of techniques that maybe we don't even have in this moment. So what is your thought about this? So how would you envision unbundling within the platform business, and how have you thought about these potential negative externalities?
Yeah, I think that is the single biggest question, followed closely by this question I have about the cost of content moderation. And it's funny that I'm sort of here today as a proponent of unbundling. If we rewound to last week at this Knight Foundation event with Cory Doctorow, he was the proponent and I was the one saying, but wait a minute, privacy. So I 100% get the concerns on both sides. And honestly, at the end of the day, is there a way forward? I don't know for sure. I just really like this because there are actually questions to ask and ways to maybe move forward versus proposals to force platforms to adopt the right speech policy when none of us will ever agree on the right speech policy, or, all of the other legal moves that I can see clearly go somewhere bad. And often somewhere unconstitutional, which leaves this being more exciting. But to delve in a little bit more on the privacy question, I mean, we can think of this as basically the Cambridge Analytica problem, right? It's one thing for me to sign up for a middleware provider that's some fly-by-night new company and trust them with my data so that I can get their lens on my Facebook feed or my Twitter feed. It's something else altogether for me to give them all of my friends' data so that, you know, a post of my cousin breastfeeding, which she intended to share only with her friends on Facebook, is suddenly being held on the servers of my sketchy middleware provider, and who knows what they're going to do with it. On the other hand, if they can't get access to privately shared content, then we can't solve this competitive problem. You know, then there isn't a way forward here. And there's a paper put out by EFF, co-authored by Bennett Cyphers and Cory Doctorow, that purports to solve this problem. I think it doesn't. I wish it did. You know, but they throw around ideas like, well, maybe the friends should have to consent. Which would be great. But, you know, if we really moved into an ecosystem with lots of middleware providers, that would mean all of us getting, you know, pop-up notices all the time asking us to consent to share data with companies we've never heard of. So that's not perfect. Or one of their answers is, well, there will be liability if there is misuse of the data by these new providers, which is great, except the data's already gone. You know, it's like Cambridge Analytica. It doesn't matter if they're liable after the fact. The data's already out there, and maybe they're not even in your same country and you don't have a way to sue them anyway. So that's not perfect. And then the other idea that gets brought up is, well, you know, Facebook should have to audit the middleware providers with whom it shares this data. Which I think it's both kind of unrealistic to think that they would be able to audit deeply enough to really know if abuse is happening or might happen in the future. Also, it's a strange competitive environment if the biggest competitor gets to audit everything that the smaller competitors are doing. So I don't think any of those are perfect. Oh, there's a fourth one. Kevin Bankston used to talk about this. What if there were an escrow system where when I migrate to another platform, I like put in here how does it work? Like a hashed version of all of my friends' IDs. And then if they migrate out too, they can identify that we're both, I can't remember. There's something with a trusted escrow system to somehow reconnect with your friends without sharing their data until they consent later on. That one sounded pretty clunky to me also. But the idea that there is an engineering-based solution, maybe if we had the right people thinking about this, you know, that I find encouraging. And I don't think we have hammered on this problem hard enough yet to know that we need to give up.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for this. And I see that we only have 3 minutes left. So I think it would be the moment to wrap up and to see either if you, Daphne, if you have any final remarks that you would like to share. On my side, I see that there are a lot of interesting questions, some initial answers, but fortunately for people like you or myself that produce research on this, there is still a lot of work to be done. And I think fortunately we have bodies like CGI that are able to convey the work that specialists do and discuss this into a multi-stakeholder setting. So I would like to ask you, Daphne, if you have any final remarks that you would like to share. Otherwise, I will give back the floor to Enrique and Marcela to run.
Well, I will just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is that Brazil is very fortunate to have the leadership that it does on these issues, to have the expertise that it has on these issues, and to have the legislative backdrop of the Marco Civil already being in place as a foundation to build on going forward. So I am excited to see where Brazil goes next. And I hope that it will be something we all want to emulate.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for this excellent conversation. I see it is already time to close down our business and to wrap up. So I would like just to invite everyone to not to miss the the next conference that will be next week. You will find all the details on the CGI website. So thank you very much to everyone. And thank you very much to CGI for having convened this first